This is the great challenge of entrepreneurship is you're handed a pen that you don't even realize that you were handed, and you're supposed to draw your field of play. And the field of play is what's your business model that you're going to custom design to help you win on. Most entrepreneurs build fields that they didn't realize they built, that they're custom built to go and lose on because they're copycatting what you're doing or what I'm doing.
But most people also fail to build a scoreboard or keep track of the score the right way or even draw the right field. They're playing football on a baseball diamond. Today, I'm talking to a good friend of mine, Todd Herman. He is the author of the best-selling book, The Alter Ego Effect, and he also has trained some of the world's highest performance athletes. But today, we're going to talk about how you can get into state, not only if you're a peak performance athlete, but also as an entrepreneur, to be able to level up the way that you're showing up in different areas of your business. And we're also going to talk about the stages of business and how to take your company from one level to the next, regardless of where you are in revenue right now. Without further ado, a good friend, smart man, dialed into performance, Todd Herman. Todd Herman, man, it's fucking always great to see you. I appreciate you carving out some time.
Brad, it's always a pleasure with the Mohawk man.
I love it. So we've known each other for years, and you've been a client with Easy Pay Direct for a very long time. And I think the beginning of that was you had a product that you still have called 90 Day Year. And I think that's kind of a reasonable starting point because it's a framework to run your business. So can you give me some backdrop on you? Because there are so many things I want to cover here. You've had these high performance athletes as clients. Some are named, some are unnamed. You've got different businesses you've run. You've done high performance coaching. But give me a little backdrop for people before we close the loops.
Yeah. So when people hear coaching nowadays, it's such a ubiquitous term, but I started in the coaching world in 1997 when it wasn't even a market. And I started a mental game and peak performance coaching company, training company that was focused directly on young, like youth athletes, like 12, 13, 15-year-old athletes. Background on me was I played college football. I was a nationally ranked badminton player, played tons of different sports. I'm not physically gifted. I'm not 6'4", 240 pounds of solid muscle. But my strength was sort of my inner game. I can credit my two older brothers for probably toughening that up for me over the years beforehand and dove into like just mindset stuff out of necessity more than anything else. And then when I got done playing college football, I was working at a high school coaching football to the defensive backs. And I spent more time with them on their mental game stuff. And I say all this because that's where I started, was way back then. And this business of mine started to take off because I started going around the province where I lived at the time, which was Alberta, Canada, and did a bunch of free speeches on what I called the triune athlete, the mentally, emotionally, and physically tough athlete. And when you align all three of these things together, all of their skill and competency is allowed to come out onto that field of play. And I started getting traction, knew that I had a good thing going, but didn't know a thing about what I was trying to do with it. And so I'm a product of mentors. I'm a big believer in apprenticing with other people. So I reached out to the biggest mental game guy in the world at the time, Harvey Dorfman. He's known as the Yoda of baseball. Talked my way into coming down and spending time with him in North Carolina during the baseball off season because he worked with all the Major League Baseball teams. He started to open up doors into working with professional athletes. So you had said about working with high performance people and what. So I ended up building the largest sports performance company in the world, sold it to Real Madrid back in 2014. My path to building that business was more off of licensing. I'm a big fan of it. And while other guys like Bob Rotella and, other people that were sort of contemporaries, Bob had been around obviously longer than myself at the time. He's the kind of Yoda of golf. They were all very much one-man shows. Even Harvey was a one-man show. And I was more entrepreneurial. I wanted to build systems. So I got into licensing and building that. And now that system that I use to work with athletes. So Kobe Bryant worked with Kobe. I'm the one who built the Black Mamba with Kobe. I was actually in California going to meet Kobe the day after his helicopter crash because we were going to bring the alter ego training that I have into his Mamba Academy. And so working with these extremely elite athletes, the underlying performance system that we were using was something I called 90 Day Year. Originally it was called 90 Day Sprint back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And now I use that same set of principles in helping entrepreneurs and businesses grow and scale so that we can keep them in a state of flow throughout their growth pattern instead of always going into overwhelm, which is typically what entrepreneurs do. Is they're always living in a world of chaos and complexity. And there's a smarter, faster, better way of approaching it. And so that's what we do.
I love that. So I want to dig into the licensing and the framework, but I want to start by highlighting what you just said, because I think it's so fucking relevant, which is people usually live in a state of chaos.
Yeah.
And what actually solves that is a framework and some sort of structure. And the irony is that usually entrepreneurs buck structure and framework because they feel the need for variety. Yeah. And it is, I find freedom, I should say, I shouldn't project. I find freedom within that discipline and structure, because then I know those things are taken care of.
Well, you're nailing it, because people have got these different paradigms that they believe that somehow variety is found in freedom, and freedom being, just open tundra, wild open grasses and hillsides and stuff where you can go and frolic. Well, no great business was ever built that way. What people come to appreciate is it's actually constraints that create variety. It's constraints that create freedom, right? Like, Picasso had a 2 foot by 2 foot painting canvas, and that's where the painting had to go. There's a constraint on it. So it actually is a forcing function for creativity. And those people who want to buck structure and buck frameworks or whatever, they're just denying what is absolute truth. That it actually is the exact opposite. It actually creates creativity. It creates variety, and allows you to express yourself with a lot more kind of robust nature built into it.
Yeah, I love that. So tell me about I have lots of conversations inevitably in my life around how, endurance athletics plays into business, right? Or how my adventure life overlaps or intersects with business. But you brought a direct parallel, which was you have a company called the 90-Day Year, which was the 90-Day Sprint, that teaches business owners a framework to operate their business. But what you said was it started as the set of principles for athletes. So can you tell me what that framework was for athletes and how it changed with businesses? Because that's a super interesting crossover. And yeah, I'd love to double click.
On the athlete side, where it was actually born out of was one of my top level athletes was, when you looked at his data, he would always have this huge performance dip in the middle of his season. And there's some sports where they have really long seasons, and so as just a solution to that problem, I said, well, why don't we just divide up your season into 2 seasons, and let's set goals for the front half and then the back half of the season. And it just worked out that it was basically 90 days long, because a baseball season typically will run about 180 days. And that's who it was. He was a baseball player. So all of a sudden there was no performance dip anymore. This 90 days thing started working. And again, now it's so funny. Like when I came out with 90-Day Year, all of a sudden in the marketplace, like when 90-Day Year exploded online, which was still a decade after I'd already launched it in the sport and corporate spaces, because Goldman Sachs uses 90-Day Year in a part of their different business units and stuff. And now all of a sudden everyone's got a 90-day coaching program or a 90-day this and all that kind of stuff. But it was really us. We were the first ones to do that. Now, the reasoning behind it, because then when I find something works, I go, okay, well, scientifically, why is this working? Because we're a sports science company. And it turns out that 90 days is about the horizon line to the motivational factor in human beings. Anything that goes beyond 90 days creates high levels of procrastination and avoidant behavior. University of California in Berkeley has done studies on it. University of Waterloo in Canada, King's College in London has done, like lots of people have looked at this 90-day kind of window of time. So those initial 7 principles that we're using in sports performance with athletes, one of the principles of performance is the principle of overload. Like, if Brad wants to develop his biceps more, well, you're going to need to overload those muscles, which you're going to have to add stress and strain to those muscles to grow them more, right?
Yes.
You're laughing as if I'm picking on your biceps, because I'm not. You're a lean, mean machine, man. So we understand that in performance. Okay, if I want something to grow, I've got to overload it. Now, just taking that one principle, we could go deep on just that on the podcast, because what most entrepreneurs do, at going back to what I was saying at the very beginning, most entrepreneurs live in a world of chaos and complexity, anxiety and stress. Well, one of the reasons is because entrepreneurs, by their very nature, they have an identity of someone who's ambitious. And ambitious people by nature will typically pick up this one performance principle. They don't know it, but they pick up this one performance principle of overload, and they use it all the time. That's the only lever that they're typically using in the way that they think about growing. Okay, well, more Facebook ads, more social media posts, more emails that go out, more channels to grow on, and they think that's going to help them grow and scale. And it's not. You'll break if you add more. Because all you're doing is you're going into overload. Well, there's another principle in performance, which is recovery and rest. So I can't do heavy set bicep curls every day of the week, because that's going to strain and stress that muscle. I'm not giving it the time to recuperate and rejuvenate, because that period after the workout is critically important, because now the muscle sinew that got torn now needs rest and recovery and to be fed so that it can come back stronger. Well, the same thing is applied in business, with the way that we're trying to work with entrepreneurs in building up a business that's constantly in flow state, looking at this just constant integration between overload and recovery, and overload and recovery. You can take it to your team level. If you just get out of doing a massive project with your team, there's a recovery phase that needs to happen with your team. So if you're someone who's just constantly pushing new marketing projects onto your marketing team, and you're not building in systemization and optimization of what you've already got, you have people on the treadmill with the incline up as high as it can go, and it's on level 10, and you're going to exhaust people. And then you wonder why you have a hard time keeping people on board. And you say to yourself, you convince yourself that, hey, listen, people just can't handle my pace. And it's like, no, your pace actually isn't built for peak performance anyway. You can run as fast as you want, but there's going to be other smarter, more strategic businesses that are going to come along and just, crush you. So those are just two of the principles that we use, overload and recovery, as lenses when we're looking at how people are operating, to see where we could create a better rhythm for the way that business is operating or working or executing or strategizing, et cetera.
So I like that. When you were running the high performance company for peak athletes, what was the structure of that like relative to the structure of training business people? So you gave us a couple lenses and where the parallels were. I'm curious about, but the way that you said it initially was basically you took the same thing and that created 90-day year. Structurally, was it the same? Did you have and I'm thinking business operations, right? I'm thinking, so you're working with a peak athlete. Was it, hey, here are the 4 different stages and here's what you go through over this period of time, and then it mapped onto 90-day year? Or was it really taking the principles and moving it that way?
So how it was all born out was, okay, here I am, I'm growing the peak athlete and I'm doing it via speaking. I was a 4-H kid. That was the only thing I knew how to do, was to go out and speak on stages and stuff. And 4-H is like agricultural Boy Scouts to people who don't know.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And so in the world of 4-H, you have to compete in a speaking competition every single year. So from the age of 10, I was in speaking competitions. It's really great. It was one of the best things I ever did. So I don't think of myself as a marketer, never did, but I started a business and business needs marketing and stuff to get out there. So my method was to go out and speak on this topic. So here I am, I'm out there speaking, I'm getting traction. The peak athlete is now getting a waiting list. I'm not stopping my speaking though, because it's working so well from a brand standpoint. I owned the Alberta market when it came to mental coaching, which probably wasn't all that hard back then because I was kind of the only one in the space. But what happens is there's people in that audience who resonated with my message around kind of alignment. And so, you're sitting in the audience, Brad, and you're the dad of a young kid. And you're always going to filter that story and that message that I have through your problems. You're going to think about your son, but you're like, geez, this guy, man, like I've got problems inside of my company with my sales team, da 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 da. And so I had people coming up to me saying, hey, I love your message. I'm just curious, do you work with any companies? Like, does this apply? And me seeing opportunity, I was like, yeah, absolutely. The principles don't apply. Peak performance is peak performance. It doesn't matter if it's applied to athletics or it's applied to entrepreneurship or business or teams. The principles don't change. And so I splintered off a company called No Limits. And I ultimately sold that. I actually sold that one before the Peak Athlete. I sold it to Chevron because I built it into a big performance training and leadership company. I sold it to the oil companies because I did a bunch of work in that space. So anyways, now going back to your question, the principles came over. The main framework that I originally had with an athlete was this OPP method, not the great hip hop group. Get down with OPP. People always make that joke, so I'll just head it off.
Obviously, where my brain was going here. Yeah, obviously, my head was already there.
Get down with OPP. Yeah, you know me. So it stands for outcome, performance, and process. It's actually a very standard methodology in the performance world. It started in the 80s. And so it starts with, so outcome is like, hey, what's that one goal? So the biggest mistake that businesses make is when I started coming into entrepreneurial world, they have so many goals that they're setting. Well, if you want to be, and that's fine, you can have a lot of goals, but you're building distraction and you're building in automatically into the structure of how you're working. You're building in waste. So every business should have one goal, period. It doesn't matter if it's IBM or if it's Joe's coaching on the street corner. One goal. That's it for your next 90 days. You can extrapolate it to your year. That's one thing. And then you get down to this next level, which is performance. Performance goals are anything that you're trying to improve in order to reach that outcome goal. So an athlete whose ultimate goal is to get onto the first line on their hockey team by the end of the year, maybe that's their goal. The question I would ask you then is, well, if you were to improve what inside of your play would give you the greatest likelihood of achieving that goal, okay? Because we're talking about probabilities. Outcome is possibility. What's possible? Now we're building in probability. And this is where it's so critically important for top achievers to focus on these last two, the two P's, because if you're only outcome focused, you're living in a level of stress and anxiety all the time because you have no control over that. You can tell me with your biggest ego all you want that you can control it, but you cannot control it because there's too many factors at play with outcomes. To the athlete, what's the weather going to be like that day? What's the competitor going to be like that day? Does the ref not like me because I look like his former son-in-law who he hates, right? And by the way, I say that one jestingly, but that's literally what happened in a football game in the NFL with one of my clients who plays with the Dallas Cowboys. He looked exactly like some refs or linesman's son-in-law or former son-in-law. So anyways, this performance layer, okay, well, what can we try to improve? How that translates then into the world of business is projects, right? Like you and I, we devote time to building projects every single month or every single, quarter. So now we call them performance-based projects. What are the projects that you're doing to improve something that's going to hit your outcome goal? And then the final one is process. So what are the tasks? What's the routines that you're doing every single day to make this all successful? So in the beginning, I brought over that one simple framework into the entrepreneurial world and the corporate world. And then we added on more nuances that need to happen for business.
I dig it. Just out of curiosity, which one do you like more? Do you like working with the performance athletes and going down that path, or do you like the entrepreneur?
They're almost the exact same. The athlete has way more controllables than the entrepreneur does. The athlete has got predefined rules for them already. Like, the field is this big. You're allowed this many players out on the field. This is what that player does out there. There's so many things that are defined for them. So it's actually a lot more rote. Like, it's a lot easier to develop a plan for someone. Entrepreneurs, this is the great challenge of entrepreneurship, is you're handed a pen that you don't even realize that you were handed. And you're supposed to draw your field of play. That's what I call it, the field of play. And the field of play is essentially comes down to, well, what's your business model that you're going to custom design to help you win on? And so that's what we're really good at with like our people that we come in and mentor, is really defining their field of play so that they can build something that they can go and win on. Most entrepreneurs build fields that they didn't realize they built, that they're custom built to go and lose on, because they're copycatting what you're doing or what I'm doing. And I'm building my business the way that I'm building it because it's leveraging already existing skills and assets and resources that I have, right? Like, I love to continue to build my business on the back of speaking on stages, because I don't need to go and learn how to speak on stages. I already know how to do that. So someone else says, oh, I like the way that Todd's building his business. I'm going to go speak on stages too. Meanwhile, you've never spoken on stages. You don't know how to put together a really powerful speech. You don't know how to actually create great bond or trust or liking with an audience. Like, those are all things that are in my wheelhouse.
And I think part of that too is that, so you said they were handed a pen they didn't know that they had and expected to build the field and the game. But most people also, back to the point of not having structure, fail to build a fucking scoreboard or keep track of the score the right way, or even draw the right field, right? Like, they're playing football on a baseball diamond, and they don't realize it because they didn't lean into the structure.
Or the other side of this is, a lot of paths to success are about sequencing. It's about doing the right things in the right order. And so what someone does is, the biggest mistake I see people make is they start executing the long-term vision now, meaning someone looks at Tony Robbins and they go, oh, I want that. And so I'm going to do exactly what Tony Robbins is doing. But what people don't realize is, where Tony actually got traction, this isn't well known. I know Tony. Tony started to do workshops in California. Okay. But he was actually quite woo-woo at the time for even California. So he couldn't get traction in California. Where he actually got traction, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. His workshop success started actually in Canada, not in the US. So he started doing his firewalking stuff up here. And again, it was smaller workshops. So I say all that because someone goes, oh, I want what Tony has. So I'm going to do a big live stream, because now Tony typically does big live streams. So let's just say that. So now he does big live streams. So I'm going to market big live streams. Well, you don't have his brand. You don't have his, audience equity built up over time. You probably don't even have the facilitation skills that Tony has yet either, on how to be dynamic still on video, because it's a hell of a lot easier to be dynamic in person than it is on video, because it's just two-dimensional. You'd be way better off in analyzing, well, where did someone come from? And that's where we're good. And I love that part, is knowing where to start with someone and say, no, this is your initial field of play. After we do that one, then we move to that field. And then we move to that field, and we're constantly, it's like almost pushing comfort zones. We're just expanding the field. But when it's the moment an entrepreneur business that's scaling is about to expand, I always get them to double check. Wait a second. Why are you doing that? Okay. Does this still map towards your core skills and resources that you have? Does it even make sense for your business model? All these things. Because sometimes, even like, we all do it, we fall in love with an idea and we forget to stress test it against, well, but is it right for me?
Yeah.
And then we end up building these traps of businesses that don't work for us.
Yeah. I think that question in general of why am I doing it is so relevant both in the macro and the micro.
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with my VP of operations last night, far later than I should have been in the office, but we were talking about dashboards and reporting. And he was driving towards a specific dashboard. And I said, why are you building this particular dashboard? What is it that you're trying to get out of it? And I could see a little frustration pop up, sort of like, well, because of, this thing that I just said. And I was like, yeah, but that thing that you just said could have 10 different variants and explanations. So what's actually underneath it that you're trying to accomplish with this dashboard? And that's a micro, but the same thing is true in the macro of just why is this campaign relevant to you? Why is this marketing channel relevant? Why is speaking on stage relevant, right?
Yeah.
Does it fit the other things you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that's like entrepreneurs are good at is outcome thinking. So I like just trying to put questions in front of them that they can use all the time. So I'll give everyone a question that you can use all the time, and it resonates with a lot of people. Is anytime you're starting a project or you're working on a marketing campaign or like whatever the thing is that you're about to go do, ask yourself or ask the team, why am I hiring this? So it's like, it's kind of giving it human attributes and saying like, well, why am I hiring this dashboard? What is the purpose of this dashboard's job now? Because it goes, where that comes from is Clayton Christensen's Jobs to Be Done framework, who was a mentor of mine when I first heard about his Jobs to Be Done framework, which is absolute brilliance. It was a Tuesday night. I living in New York City, and I drove up to Harvard where he was the maybe the dean of business there. And I drove up there and I sat in on one of his classes in the afternoon, and I walked down the little stairs, and I went up to him and said, I just heard about your Jobs to Be Done framework yesterday, and I had to drive and come meet you. And he's like, wait, you just drove from New York City to come in? And I'm like, yeah, like when I get an idea and someone shares something that's phenomenal in my brain, I got to come and, meet you. And so he became a sort of quasi mentor in many ways. But that whole, why are you hiring this is a Jobs to Be Done question. And I love that question for myself. Like, why am I hiring this podcast? Like, what job is this like if I was going to launch a podcast, what job is it going to do for me? And so it's like, I just love talking to people. So it's going to satisfy that for me. I need a platform to speak from, all these different things. But then sometimes if you don't have a good answer right off the bat, then it's a bad hire.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, so I want to ask a little bit further about the framework that you use, because I think it'll be helpful specifically in different size groups. And then I want to talk about a couple companies that are super relevant to certainly the Easy Pay Direct audience, but I think entrepreneurs in general. But let's talk 90-day year. So I know a little bit about the framework, and I know that we've had a bunch of clients go through it. Through that lens, what are the different stages of business, and how does that map to revenue?
Yeah.
And I'm asking that because I want to talk about kind of the upper end and some of the differences between those stages. But as I recall, you've got kind of a concrete approach to the stages of growth.
So we have this 5 stages of business framework. People can go to 90year.com. They can Google it in 5 stages of business, 90-day year, and they can go and read all about it. But think of it like a pyramid. At the very bottom is the stage of startup. And in every single one of these stages, there's certain milestones and a key focus that you're working on at each one of these. So in startup, that key 3 milestones that you're hitting is, who am I exactly going after with this product service business? What is their main pain point that I'm focusing on? Or what is their pain point? And then third, what is that product, service, widget thing I'm going to put in front of them that they're going to engage with? And most businesses, there's a lot of businesses that are $1 million plus in revenue, but they're really actually still in startup because they haven't actually nailed those 3 things. And it's really hard to scale a business when, if I asked you, who is your exact customer that you go after? And if people don't have a good answer, I know that there's a lot of insecurity built into that company because their ability to go and market well, copy well, all that stuff. They're how you know that you haven't nailed those 3 milestones inside of a business is you need to churn up the waters a lot with your marketing in order to get people into your world.
Well, the other is when you're interacting with any entrepreneur, I would, and you got, if somebody listening just tries to go do this, you're probably going to create some friction, but you can get an answer really quickly internally as to whether that person is still on that stage or not, because their marketing message isn't clear. They typically have too wide of an audience, and they don't deliver the messaging, right? So you say, hey, who's your target market? If they have to think about that really at all, then it's probably not that dialed. And hey, how are you different than this other company? If you don't have an answer to that, also probably not that dialed in terms of what your USP is to deliver. And so if you as an entrepreneur find yourself doing that, that's a really good flag to say, hey, this is probably a barrier to scale right now.
Yeah. Well, like even you, like it's so easy for me to send clients to EPD because, the space that you own in my head is EPD works with entrepreneurs or businesses in high risk markets. High risk markets could mean like, Stripe or Chase or whatever looks at you and goes, I don't know about that market or that industry. And the great thing about that even is everyone thinks they're in high risk, but so you could be serving everybody, but the truth is there actually are a handful of high risk markets that are out there, but that's the space that you own. And so it's very easy for me then to give referrals and testimonials to people and send them your way.
Yeah. Well, and I think that as, relative to Easy Pay Direct, as you grow and as you get bigger, you can start with a narrow space and then create another marketing message for another vertical and create another marketing message for another vertical. But if you go into it in the beginning and try to have a marketing message for everybody that doesn't speak to one specific person, it becomes very challenging to handle objections and to actually functionally sell.
You know what sucks about this conversation though, Brad, is the fact that there are 100 other interviews happening today with, experienced business owners and stuff. And everyone's saying the same thing, niche, you got to get the niche. And yet still, like after people being bombarded with this message for 2 decades plus, they still don't do it. It's always shocking and surprising to me. Like I got lucky early on when I started the Peak Athlete because I didn't know about niching, but the thing I knew was the people who had the most money in Canada in sport were hockey people. It was an expensive sport to play. And I happened to know 2 people who could bring me in to do workshops and a speech on the topic. So I chose hockey. And I had a lot of dumb luck with that. And the great thing about saying, hey, I literally only do mental game and peak performance strategy for hockey players is the moment you close the door. Dan Kennedy talks about this. What does every cat, where does every cat want to go? Every cat wants to go on the other side of the door, right? So when you close a door, they're pawing at it. Let me in. And anyway, I've got a cat. We close the door. It freaking scratches like 8 seconds later. It could have been sleeping downstairs. And when it hears the door close, it's like, okay, what just happened? I'm not allowed into a place. And so I would have people who come up to me after speeches and say, listen, I know you only work with hockey players, but I have a daughter who's a figure skater, or I've got a son who plays soccer and he's struggling with confidence and Can you work with him? And my answer was, yeah, because I didn't work with the players on their actual physical skills. I worked with them on the mental and the emotional game, all inner game world stuff. So niching is actually still a powerful way of going broad without actually saying that you're broad.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I know where it comes from. If you look at, bootstrap companies, and it's a lot of the time it comes from the insecurity of not being able to feed yourself. It comes from like, shit, I don't want to lose business because I need money to come in. And I see less of that. If you look at kind of the strategic approach, I'm going to call it strategic, but if you look at funded companies, heavily funded companies, it's clear that the first thing you do is find product market fit by getting the right messaging and the audience that you're pursuing. And you look at run rate, right? You look at how quickly you can get there and how much you can burn in order to get there. But that should be step one before you go anywhere else. And I think very often you see the bootstrapped entrepreneurs like myself, where if it's very early, you say, somebody would have said to me, well, who do you serve? And I'd say, anybody that accepts credit cards.
Yeah.
And as I got further in business, I was like, the first thing that I want to eliminate is this group, and then this group, and then this group. And I was getting to this place of who can I serve best, right? And now it's clear to me that inside the walls of Easy Pay Direct, and this took a while, but inside the walls of Easy Pay Direct, somebody that's accepting payments online, typically not swiping payments, and doing at least $1 million a year in revenue, up to probably about 100 million, man, those are the people that we're going to create raving fans 98 out of 100 times. And are there people on each end? Yeah, for sure. But those are the ones where we provide a shit ton of value and people love it. And as soon as we try to stretch a little, mass distraction takes it out of the frame, right? It's harder for us. It's square peg, round hole a little bit more, right? It might still work, but it's not the way that you can scale, like you said.
Well, that gets to, so going back to the stages thing. So we that's startup, and then you graduate to ramp up, and ramp up is where you're really now dialing in your main marketing channel that you're trying to grow on, the sales system as well. And then you're still iterating on your product and you're making it better. You're improving it. So that's kind of what you're doing in ramp up, because you're ramping up this thing that you've now validated out into a market. And then that gets to build up stage, and build up is, you've been ramping things up, marketing and sales. On the back end, it feels like a burning house fire, right? And that's natural. So if someone's in that stage of, man, the back end operations just feels like it's an absolute, gong show. Yeah, that's the natural part of the process. That's the evolution of any great business. And so now in build up, you're now focused on building up the systems and the processes. You're now starting to put in more structure and the ways that we do things here. And this is actually where people play. Remember the board game Chutes and Ladders or Snakes and Ladders as a kid?
Oh, yeah.
So it's a game where, like you're climbing up and then you land on a spot and you slide back down the game board to like spot number 15 on the board. Well, most people in business do that because it's the idea of I sell a lot, then I got to go deliver. Then I sell a lot and I got to go deliver. And if that's the process you're in this sort of purgatory of ramp up, build up, ramp up, build up, ramp up, build up, and you keep on going down and around and around. And you haven't really engineered the business system or the performance system so that you've got foundations in place that can get you into now the next level, which is scale up. So build up is all about fortifying your back-end operations, simplifying delivery or fulfillment, and bringing in people to help solve that for you as well. And by the way, in build up, you're not adding new marketing channels. That's the biggest mistake that people will make, going after brand new marketing channels or brand new sales channels, because you haven't built out the system yet for those other ones.
So tell me about revenue metrics or human metrics, or what size companies do you see in build up?
Well, they're all over the map. Like, I've seen businesses that are in build up that do $250,000 a year. I've seen businesses that are in startup ramp up that are doing $6-7 million a year. And for them, that entrepreneur's life is extraordinarily painful because they haven't clearly defined where they're competing in the market. Again, that's a weak part of the building block at the bottom of this. They haven't really codified and systemized their marketing and sales systems that they have. They convert people on multiple types of things. I do phone sales and I do webinar sales, and I do that's when you have multiple conversion methods inside of your business, it's complicated then. Unless you're in scale up and you have teams and people and growth groups that are, handling each one of these different means of getting people in the door. So it's actually not about even revenue level. It's more about the experience that someone has. So let me just go through those last two stages. So scale up is you've now removed yourself. How you're in scale up is you've removed yourself from a lot of the day-to-day operations in the business, and you're sort of, puppeteering things. The biggest mistake entrepreneurs make when they're in that stage is, they're twiddling their thumbs. I got time on my hands. You know what? Let me go and check in on my team. Let's tinker. And then you go back and you start breaking the systems that you just built, or you hired other people who are smarter than you at them are building. And instead, in scale up, the real focus here is you go from actually advocating for products and you go advocating for brand. So it's not that I'm not talking about the 90-day year course again, because we have an online digital course that people can take. I start talking about the brand. I'm a brand advocate around 90 year. And I talk about, we have a sports performance approach. Why do we have a sports performance approach? Because most entrepreneurs are living in overwhelm, complexity, and chaos. And we want to keep people in flow state, which is what we've done with athletes. And so we do the same thing with entrepreneurs who want to have peak performing businesses. You're just talking about your brand message. You're building culture. And then the final stage is leader up. And leader up isn't something that you can necessarily engineer. You know you're in leader up when the market says that you're the leader. And also in scale up and leader up is when you're adding maybe new channels or you're adding a new product and stuff like that. So that's the path.
I dig it. I appreciate the framework. I think that's a good look. There are never-ending questions around operations relative to different stages, but I think one of the takeaways in general there is that it's not about where you are in revenue. It's about where you are structurally and how the business is operating. And you can drive significant volume or to, decently significant sizes and miss a point, but you're going to feel it, right? So I think we all know entrepreneurs at very different stages that experience a ton of pain running a business because they're trying to do too much and they haven't put the systems in place. And sometimes those entrepreneurs are at $500,000 a year and sometimes they're at $40 million a year. But they just don't have the clean systems to run the business that is there in front of them.
Like the most inspiring entrepreneurs for me are always, it's not about revenue for me. It's the ones who just have such a disciplined approach. It's the same thing with athletics and working with just different elite athletes. Those ones who are just absolutely disciplined. I remember talking to Shannon Sharp, the great kind of tight end for the Denver Broncos back in the day. And one of his favorite things to do was to go to the movie theaters during the off season or even during the off season with his girlfriend or wife and ordering popcorn and then putting it on the seat next to him and never having one piece of popcorn. He did it because he wanted to test his own discipline because he freaking loves popcorn. He's like, that is my Achilles heel. And he's like, every time I would go, it was like I was forging greater strength within me. Because I resisted that for 2.5 hours. And like, that's how elite people think. They just do things a lot differently. They're doing things purposely to test their own resolve for the mission or purpose that they're on.
Well, let's talk about that because that's actually a great transition to an alter ego. So you wrote a book called The Alter Ego Effect. I want you to kind of give the paradigm for it, but there are two approaches here. You just outlined an example of somebody that is a peak performer that is doing something to test them, right? And a lot of people, probably even that same person, would say a framework where you don't have to test yourself, but you're automatically building a habit is the path to get to excellence. So tell me about the alter ego effect, but through that lens, what's your suggestion in peak performance? Or are those two things really the same?
Well, the suggestion around peak performance, like my quote that I give people is, peak performance is a subtractive process. It's not about more. It's about subtract, remove, delete. So many people in the way that they're operating in their lives or in their business, they're doing so much stuff. And then they beat themselves up around the fact that they're not doing it all, or they're doing most of it average or poorly or whatever the case is. So peak performance is, let's look at your backpack. Let's remove a bunch of the stuff that shouldn't be there anyway, because you're climbing a really steep hill here. Like what you're trying to go do is very challenging and difficult. The athletes nowadays, most of them are trying to build up personal brands so that they can capitalize on whatever audience opportunity that they have. And then they wonder why they are never going to be legends in the game. Michael Jordan, he had his Nike deal, but he had that deal. You have a very small window of time to be excellent in your sport. And by the way, once it's gone, you're going to find out in a very harsh way how irrelevant you are. Most athletes have a very hard time after retirement where no one gives them attention anymore. So going back to the whole alter ego thing, it became this golden thread that was weaving all these top performers that I was working with together. I used an alter ego when I played sport. And so anytime someone would bring it up, I'd be like, oh, that's really cool. I did the exact same thing. So it wasn't a method that I was working with people on yet. And then it was in 2003, as I was getting an athlete ready for the Olympics in Athens. She was a swimmer on the U.S. swim team, and she had mentioned her identity that she would step into when she would go into the swimming pool. And then all of a sudden, all these other conversations, sort of like a domino effect, tumbled into my head. And I was like, oh, this is an actual thing. Interviewed her on what her method was, talked to all the other athletes. Hey, what's your process? Coupled that with my process. And then I built out this method. And the alter ego in its root form means the other I or trusted friend within. Cicero coined it in 44 BC. And so the alter ego for someone else is the vision of what you're trying to move towards to help you in context to a very specific role or identity that you have in life. You don't have one governing alter ego that lives in everything that you do. That's a trap. That's the same as if you just have one identity that you try to take into all your life. That's a trap, because there's no way you can optimize that identity to be great as a dad, as an athlete, or fitness person that's going to take care of your body, as a CEO, as a speaker, as a coach, as a trainer, as a author. All these things, like when you actually extrapolate it out, we actually have many roles and identities that we have in life. This alter ego became this extremely usable object that I could use with an athlete to help them disassociate from whatever they think about themselves and custom build something that's going to be built to win on that field of play over there. The power of it is, remember, 70% of our brain is dedicated to the visual cortex. Most people are actually pretty bad at building visions of what they're trying to move towards, because some people just can't see themselves do it, but they can see someone else do it. They're like, oh, of course Brad can do it. Or of course Kobe can do it. Or of course Beyonce could go do it. If it's easy for them, why don't we just employ the identities of someone or something else that you're inspired by and use that as a model for helping you to pull more of your capacity out of yourself?
I love that I was in the same breath as Kobe and Beyonce just now. That was fantastic.
You're welcome. Yeah. Use that as your soundbite clip.
That's great. So I know that you've got some time constraints. Speaking of constraints here, what are, like, let's say somebody wants to lean into the alter ego. Obviously, they can go read your book. We'll put a link in the show notes. But if somebody is trying to get into a peak performance state, what are a couple tips that you have for creating an alter ego and leaning into that?
Just a couple of them would be, as a part of the method that I unpack inside the book. One, clearly identify what the traits are and abilities that you're bringing into that role, whatever it might be. And traits can be, for me, Super Richard was this alter ego that I built in business. And I built Super Richard long time ago because I was avoiding doing sales calls. I wasn't getting myself out there. I was terribly fearful of rejection and resistance. And so Super Richard was a composite of three of my heroes, Benjamin Franklin, Superman, and Joseph Campbell. And when I thought about what it was about them that I was so drawn towards, Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero's Journey, he's the mythologist who's famous for that entire world. I loved the way that he articulated his ideas. It just drew me in, his storytelling. And I wasn't very articulate. So it was mapping towards an insecurity that I had. So now I was going to be drawing on that superpower that he had. Superman was just, the man of action, right? And I wasn't taking action. So that's what I was drawing towards. I wanted that trait of being just decisive and taking action. And then Benjamin Franklin was someone that, he had 7 lifetimes in one lifetime. Like, the man knew how to morph into brand new careers. Like, it was incredible, his career. And I've read his biography 89, 90 times. I know it so well. So I was drawing on those traits. That's what I wanted to bring out there. Now, the second part of that then is, well, how can I activate this? You actually do this great, Brad. You have your mohawk. Okay. And that's very much a defining part of who and how you show up and what you're about. But people don't know how powerful uniforms, totems, artifacts are. And so when you're thinking about these different roles that you play, what's an artifact that you can wear? What's a uniform that you could have to help you embody those traits easily? So, I went out and bought a pair of non-prescription glasses back in the late 90s so that I could embody Super Richard. Some of that was because I wanted to look older than I was because I had a baby face. I looked like I was 12 years old. I'm standing on stages talking about this like inner game stuff. And so those glasses for me were about me switching on Super Richard. I was going to feel smarter. I was going to feel more articulate. I was going to feel more like I was decisive and taking action. And so coupling those two things together, finding an artifact or a totem or a uniform that you wear that when you put it on activates the traits, and it actually maps towards so many different psychological switches that are inside the brain anyway. You're leveraging the human experience to guide you towards the peak performance that you want. And you're being more playful and creative at the exact same time. Because at the end of the day, the final lock on the door to get into zone and flow state is playfulness and creativity. If you do not have an attitude of playfulness, it is very difficult for you to ever get into flow and zone state, which is where all of your capacity comes pouring out of you. And an alter ego helps to just trigger all these things.
Got it. So for the sake of business, so I think as an athlete, it's go time. You've got to show up, you've got to play. And so you referenced Kobe Bryant and the Black Mamba earlier as a alter ego that you were a part of. And that was his performance mode. As an entrepreneur, can you give me a couple use cases? And is it one, hey, I've got my entrepreneur hat, or is it or do you have multiple alter egos that you're deploying to perform effectively in business?
Well, that's the challenge. You had asked me before about, which one do I like working with more? Well, they're so similar, but entrepreneurship has way more challenges in it. That's why I love working with entrepreneurs. Okay, when I started working with entrepreneurs back in like the late 2000s, because I was very much a sports and kind of corporate guy, like my companies that I built, I didn't work with as many entrepreneurs. It was a great challenge because there are so many roles you have to play as an entrepreneur. So no, having one as the entrepreneur doesn't really work. And so for me, Super Richard was built for the sales side of my business because I was not making the phone calls and I wasn't promoting myself. So he was what I called the advocate for Todd's stuff. Todd, I never had any insecurities around being a great coach. No insecurities there. But I did have insecurities around promoting myself and selling myself or selling the peak athlete and all that kind of stuff. So when you take a look at the pain points that you might be having in your entrepreneurial experience, where do they sit? Some of them, like for people in build up and scale up, their challenges around leading people. And I've said this for people like entrepreneurs are terrible leaders. They're great self-leaders, but they're terrible leaders of other people. It's not something that really comes natural to many entrepreneurs. They think that they're great leaders, but when I get them to do an analysis, they're like, oh yeah, maybe I'm not a great leader. But if you want to get your business to the level you want to get it to, or, achieve the goals that you have, you better become a great leader. And that's typically where people break down, is in that one role as being a leader of their business.
I dig it. So I think about that, and you could add color to this if it makes sense. But I think about it sort of as like, what hat am I wearing right now?
Yeah.
And if I have to have the leader hat on, or if I have to have the podcast host hat on, those are different roles in my life, and I am going to behave differently, communicate differently, show up differently.
100%. Well, I mean, I use the example in the book. I mean, Winston Churchill would stand in front of his wall of hats and he would ask himself, which self should I be today? And when he was standing in front of his wall of hats, there's a story that his wife talked about when he was getting called to King George's residence to be named as the new prime minister of England. And he would stand there and he's looking at his hats, and she said, put on the top hat. That's the Winston that needs to show up at Buckingham Palace today. And so you're exactly right. It's hats that you're switching. Now, that in itself is a useful kind of, mental image. And I just say, well, maybe you don't wear a hat, maybe like me, you have a pair of glasses that you have, or you have a certain uniform that you wear. And now to give it to a usable form, like something that's tactical. So where you show up as a leader might be on your Zoom calls, on those, all hands meetings that you have. Like how can you be a stronger leader there? Like how can you be a better storyteller? How can you unite people? How can you call people out and in front of other people and say how much they are honoring one of the core values of your business because of something that they did last week? Like, hey, Brad, just wanted to say, even though you're not in the customer support department, you stayed late to help us clean up a bunch of tickets inside of wherever they are. And I just want to say, like, that honors the core value that we have around, we're all on the same team. And anyways, Brad, just wanted to say thanks for that. And we're lucky to have you on the team. Catching people doing things right is not a skill set of most people. And then you think about those different touch points where you're a leader in your business and, who or what might be inspired for you to be more like them. And that becomes the alter ego for you.
And you're in this case, you're talking about artifacts and uniforms, and those are an anchor to remind you or to put you in state to behave in this way. You're connecting the dots between that anchor and the behavior. Is that right?
It's ritualizing a routine. So we talk about the difference between high performers and peak performers. High performers, they have their habits and they have their routines. The difference between the very elite and the peak performers and people who can still be above average performers is they do a way better job of adding story and narrative as to why they're doing the thing. So you and I both have a glass of water sitting in front of us and we start our day with a big glass of water. You drink it because it's a part of your routine. I drink it and it's a very different meaning to me because in my head, when I'm drinking that glass of water, I'm drinking all of the souls of the people who want to come after me. Because that's actually one of the frames that one of the greatest athletes of all time, who was a client, thinks of it. When he is drinking water on the sidelines or when he starts his day, he's taking souls. He's taking the souls of the people who've been trying to come after him for decades and knock him off his perch. And that's a very different level of the body changes, like the vibrational level of the body changes because he's ritualizing a routine. So when I'm putting on these glasses, I'm not just putting on glasses. I have an entire story and ritual that was built over time that's now happens in an instant, that these glasses embodied the traits of Superman, Joseph Campbell, and Benjamin Franklin. And I would practice getting into that. Like, what would it, if I was actually supremely confident like Benjamin Franklin, if I was actually a man of action, exactly like Superman, and if I was very articulate, just like Joseph Campbell, how would I feel if they were standing behind me, watching me say that I am Benjamin Franklin, Superman, and Joseph Campbell? Like I would, if I say, hey, I'm going to represent you in the way that I'm going to go out there, watch me, I better honor them well in their way that they would go out there. And then when I put on those glasses, that's when they would appear behind me and watch. Okay, so you say that you're going to represent my traits and character abilities. Let's see it happen. And the moment I would fall out, I would start to doubt myself. The glasses had to come off because that is not in alignment with that core identity I have. And I get it. Some people go, wow, this sounds intense. Well, listen, I'm not for the masses. I only work with elite human beings. And there is a difference between the people who get elite results and people who have been reading the popsicle, bubblegum, and cotton candy crap that's sitting inside of self-help and personal development. Because all those people who write those books have typically never worked with the elite. And there is a different attitude that those people have at that level. And I can take that same energy to who I am as a dad to my kids. There's a reason why Mr. Rogers is sitting behind me, because that's the identity that I have when I'm with my kids. And I grew up watching Mr. Rogers and I know what his behavioral traits are like. And so I'm inspired by both Mr. Rogers and my dad in who I want to be around my kids, because this challenger personality that I just kind of unpacked with who I am when I'm with clients That I don't want my kids to be around the challenger dad. That's not who I am. That's me playing a very effective role to help me win on that field with high caliber human beings that are trying to accomplish very difficult things and are constantly bumping up against the edges of their own competency zones. But when I'm with my kids, I want them to experience someone who's playful, fun, creative, loving, patient, kind. And I don't wear my glasses. I don't wear that uniform around my kids. I have a different uniform that I have. It allows me to be very intentional about what I'm trying to bring to those different experiences that I have in my life so that I can stay on track with, leading the life that I want to lead.
Yeah, I love that. And you said something that I think is a big takeaway for people in general. And you positioned it as rigid in your approach, but you said, as soon as I realize that I'm falling out of character, or if I'm doing something that's misaligned, the glasses come off. It behooves everybody to look at areas of their life where they're convoluting a habit that they're trying to build. And when I think about my dog, for example, we say all done. And when we're all done, the ball does not get thrown again, period. And there is no violating that game ever. Because as soon as I violate that rule and I say all done, then throw it, my dog is pretty fucking persistent. And that dude will stare at me for the next 45 minutes waiting for another throw if the rule ever gets violated, because he's hoping that it might work, right?
Yeah.
But if it's a definitive rule and no matter what, that's it, then we keep the rule set clean. And I think in human development and in excellence, if you are rigid in your approach, even if, does it really matter if you have one more drink right now? Does it really matter if you sleep in for 5 more minutes? Does it really matter if you don't do the extra rep? The answer is yes, because it reproduces itself later in behavior.
Yeah. Well, the word that comes up, I bring up every day to people is decidue. Decidue is the root of the word decision, which means to cut away. And the great thing about what you're doing is you're creating an environment with language that is just, there's no other decision to be made. It's like when I say done, all done, it's done, right? Even in your own brain, you're creating more capacity for other things because there is no nuance. There's no gray area there, right? Like the glasses when they're on, there's no gray area. I know exactly who I am in this moment and what I was built to go and do, right? And when I put on the little bracelet that I have that my kids gave me, I know exactly why I'm putting that on. And that's to be the type of father that I want to be to those 3 little kids, to give them the greatest chance of success in their own lives as well.
That's great. Okay, well, I know we're at time. Where do people find out more about Todd Herman and life, and wherever you want to point them, man?
Yeah. So toddherman.me is my home base on the interwebs, and, all the links and stuff to, whether it's social on Instagram and everywhere else, I'm pretty much Todd_Herman, and I share lots of stuff on there. But at toddherman.me, they can find out more like about 90-Day Year World or Alter Ego, and even our software platform UpCoach that I'm building out for coaches and people in the expert space to help them build their businesses with a lot more simplicity. So that's where you can go.
Awesome. I know how many people we work with love UpCoach. I also know that I like getting free stuff and awesome deals for the Easy Pay Direct audience. What could you do for the EPD audience that's different than what you normally offer people?
We can give them 20% off any plan that they go and get with us. There's 3 different ways that they can get involved, depending on whether you're scaling up or whether you're somewhere in the kind of startup zone of your coaching business. We'll give you 20% off your account. Plus, I'll also throw in a course that I'm just completing now that we're selling for $1,000. I'll give that to people for free once they get into their account. And it's all around how you build a transformation-led growth business engine that helps you to grow your coaching and training company without having to put a whole bunch of marketing and sales effort into it. It has these 4 core pillars that I've used to grow all of my coaching and training companies. And it's actually the proper business model of someone who is in coaching and training. And what it does is it actually produces tons of referrals for you, tons of testimonials for you, and tons of client advocates. And it maps so perfectly because it's essentially exactly the ecosystem that we have in what we're trying to build for UpCoach. So the actual software supports that. And then I'm also going to give you the training. So I'll give that to people from your world for free once they set up their account.
Todd Herman, I appreciate you carving out the time, man. It's always good to hang out.
Cheers, buddy.
Use code BeyondUpCoach20, all caps, to save 20% today and join thousands of satisfied customers that use UpCoach to build and distribute their content.
Love it. I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed doing it. I need your help. There are 3 places you can find Beyond a Million. The podcast itself, beyondamillion.com, which has some cool free resources, including a free course. And we finally launched the Beyond a Million YouTube channel. I would love it if you would go there and subscribe. And if you don't want to, you still would probably enjoy seeing the visual content. Check it out, youtube.com/@Beyond a Million.